So good afternoon, and thanks for joining us in this panel session on the applications of AI/ML to support DHS. Now, obviously, this is a huge topic, right? And to provide some guidance, we want to think about how DHS can apply these technologies in the context of smart, secure, and resilient communities. So, for example, infrastructure resiliency and preparedness and response. So, in that context, let's get started with a fundamental question. So, while we know AI/ML is a tool set of capabilities, what are the problems that you would like to use it to solve? And as you're answering that question, with each one of you, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what your organization does. So Dan, I'm going to start with you in DHS S&T.
Yes, thank you, Reggie. So I'm at DHS Science and Technology. We have a role in really trying to help formulate how the adoption of new technologies rolls into the DHS mission space. And when you look at the DHS mission space, probably around Homeland Security, that includes the work we do with our state, local, tribal, territorial, other partners, including infrastructure. So it's a very, very broad and complex mission. We're very interested, but also concerned about AI. Obviously, we think it can bring a lot of efficiency and more effectiveness to many of our missions. Thinking about cyber, physical risks to critical infrastructure, securing borders, facilitating lawful trade and travel. But also, as Reggie mentioned up front, the cost of human and man-made disasters. How do we do response, local, state, federal, integrated response? At the same time, we view AI as something that's accelerating threats, can accelerate conflict, and accelerate competition. So something we also need to be worried about, not just about its beneficial use. So within that structure, we have developed AI strategy. If you go online, you can find both the Department of Homeland Security's AI strategy, as well as the S&T strategy specifically targeted at how we're going to handle AI. And I'll talk more about that perhaps as the panel progresses. Thanks, Reggie.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yemi, over to you.
Thanks, Reggie. In DHS, and more specifically in immigration, we're the arm of the federal government that provides immigration benefits. And so the immigration benefits to millions and millions of folks. A lot of what we do is first identify who we're giving the benefits to. We have to discern who you're related to, where you've been, what benefits you require or need. And then it's really going through a workflow and disseminating those benefits. And doing that, identity is a huge issue for us to make sure we're giving the benefits to the right person and someone doesn't take the benefits that doesn't belong to them. So where AI can help us is really finding those patterns and how we identify who is really who they are, and really trying to prevent people from being someone else. Because in the digital world, we know there's a lot of opportunity to spoof, and you've heard of deep fakes and things of that nature. So that's where we have that wall of protection that AI/ML can support us on. The other thing is really facilitating how fast we can get a benefit and how efficient we can go through the workflow. So there are things like that we look at, like computer vision. We use natural language processing. How can we define, what documents are what kind of are pertain to a certain kind of person? And really, if you look at those documents and way in the future, how can we get abstract information from those official documents to really get an official identity? So in our space, it's really about getting information, having the right information, applying it the right way through a lot of data.
So thank you, Yemi. Appreciate that. Brian, over to you.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And very similar kind of focus around DHS and the others. So I lead up a organization at Red Hat that focuses on law enforcement as well as associated agencies. And we see the emergence of AI/ML really as a platform solution surrounding around data. So whether it's working with biometrics, whether it's working with port solutions, whether it's working with FEMA on data collection and enablement, that whole investment around how do you properly take data, train models, move it out of a scientific pursuit and actually moving it to a production resource. We've worked with a lot of Homeland Security agencies in order to make that possible. As you start to bring those data solutions forward and make them more field focused, the concentrations around security and how do you kind of put that into a standard DevSecOps pipeline and making that pipeline actions available is an area that we certainly as Red Hat is investing, as well as other industry partners. So creating that, that proper ecosystem where we can start to push these proper data products and ML solutions out. So folks like Yemi can take advantage of that with the United States Immigration Services, as well as FEMA from an operation for fire and flood, are areas that we're certainly concentrating on. And certainly happy to talk a little bit further about smart city solutions, as well as other use cases that we're actively involved with at DHS. So appreciate being part of the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. One of the things, let's get down to some specific use cases, because you mentioned that, Brian, right? You just said, in smart cities. Dan or Yemi, can you talk to just specific cases where you are trying to use it right now? And maybe Dan, if you start talking more from a headquarters perspective, and Yemi from an operational perspective.
Well, again, we're a research organization, so we're not really involved right now in driving operational mission. Our role really in this space is to try to understand the requirements from the components of DHS, and then look at how the AI is evolving. So working with the National Science Foundations, other research organizations. Some of the initial use cases, though, clearly, cyber's use cases around AI, so we're investing in. But as we look at use cases around smart, secure, resilient communities, as Brian was mentioning, there's an awful lot there. One of the problems we're really looking at is just the volumes of data. Right now, spending on IoT, Internet of Things, is over $1.4 trillion. Projections are by the end of this decade, 2030, there'll be 500 billion interconnected devices out there, device cost dropping down to $1 or so. So how do you avoid the information paralysis that comes with that when everything out there can be instrumented? Some of the work we're doing right now around low-cost flood sensors, low-cost violence sensors, we're looking at how we put more, if you will, decision rights or decision authority into that device. Some use cases are pretty simple, and it's for machine learning and just a simple rule set, say for a flood sensor that knows when to close a floodgate, perhaps knows when to close a low water crossing so people don't drive it and drown. But at what point do you want to allow more authority to devices like that, particularly as they mesh together and interconnect and inform larger and larger problems across the community? So a lot to think about here. But I'd say we're really just at the infancy of really understanding what the true requirements are, the ability of AI, ML to match. And just a side comment, I mean, Brian mentioned this, one of the things that I think we're all struggling with a bit, where are the real data sets out there that you can train and test these things on? How do we make sure that those data sets don't have biases in them, and that over time, perhaps they become something that isn't making the right decisions that we want? And finally, to do these things and still make sure we're adhering to all the privacy, civil rights, civil liberties types of constraints that we need to conform to assure people's rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So I want to go back to you in a little bit about kind of research directions, but before I do that, Yemi, could you talk to, Dan just brought up the issue of data, right? And I know you've talked about identity issues and trying to figure that out and entity resolution, these kinds of things. Could you talk about what you're doing specifically in some of your programs and how you're trying to come up to speed and use these kind of capabilities?
Yeah, definitely, Reggie. And I do want to frame it in the backdrop of what Dan just talked about. One of the things, you started out about smart cities. The core of what folks like to talk about in smart cities is the credential. Who am I and how do I have access to a lot of different things in a smart city? Well, shed the light back onto immigration. And there's a population of folks that come here in different parts of their journey. So some folks come in and say, I need a benefit. Some folks come in and say, I'm in great danger. Some folks come in and unfortunately, we're trying to take them out of the country because they don't belong here. So each point we interact with that individual, but each point that individual has a different sentiment and wants to give you an identity. Sometimes they're motivated to give you an identity that makes sense. So, I talk about the declared information that we get as data. If I'm here for a benefit, I'm going to give you every piece of information that I need to give you so that I can declare my identity, you can track me, and I can get my benefit. But if perhaps that, we're in a position where there's someone antagonistic and you shouldn't be here, you're not motivated to give a lot of identity. And oh, by the way, sometimes that same individual accesses us in multiple phases of that journey, and they're the same person. So how do we ensure that that person is who they say they are? A lot of that comes with some of the models being trained to say, how are certain names consistent from certain cultural backgrounds? If someone changed an addresses multiple times, is there a pattern? Are there patterns of locations and geographies where folks are? But a lot of times when we're in the operational mode, we don't have the opportunity to train that model well. and that's where bias gets introduced because we're reacting. To Dan's point, I think we need test beds to be able to say, here's a certain population, here's a certain scenario. How do we train it? How do we make that data available to different components operating different missions, but they're all related? So what happens is it's not just the data, but it's the data use and the perspective of the data at the time that you're engaging with someone or at the time that you're executing a mission. And I think one of the things we can press forward on that would help us in the operating world is really trying to figure out how we really train those models well before we put them in operation. Because what happens is once they get in operation, we're dealing with auto ML and we're dealing with AI that actually is going to be functioning. It will start to create a bias or it'll start to create its own trajectory. I mean, that's really what it's there for. But we want to be able to predict at least to a great deal what it's going to do, so we're applying the mission properly.
Let me follow up on that. I appreciate your answer. Can you explain like how you start to engage with AI, right? Like so you go from a pilot to enterprise. How does that whole flow actually work?
So it happens a lot of different ways. So you can engage with the vendor, and you can have ML on a platform where we know, for example, we get most of the time declared data for a person. Well, our goal there is just to make sure that we're covering all the different permutations, we're covering all the different scenarios where data is, and we train a model based on what we've done in the past. And so you'll have I'll put air quotes here, a research phase, but because we're operators, that's really not defined as pure research. It's us doing development, testing, to the best of our ability to get a product out in the ground. And oh, by the way, we don't really get to test that vendor's product against a ton of other products because we're usually going through an acquisition phase, and we've acquired it through competitive acquisition. We haven't done the full landscape of testing, but we've done enough to make sure it's a solid product. One of the things that I mentioned before is if we leverage a real research arm, how could we really say, I'm going to take 5 different types of models and 5 different types of environments and really test that thing thoroughly and show all the warts, show the things that it can do over longer periods of time. Then we can say, well, I know what to expect. And so our engagement through the vendors, typically what'll happen. Other engagements can be through another agency where we've seen it in production and we say, well, we like how that works. We'd like to leverage that in our area. And now, honestly, there's model as a service, right? There are models that you can actually purchase, acquire, some that really sit on platforms that you can say, it says it does this, so we'll use it that way. So those are some kind of ways we engage.
So I appreciate that. So something to think about. I want to go to Brian from his experience in terms of actually operationalizing these kinds of tools. I want to come back to you and talk about culture, right? Because there was an interesting article in Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago. It said one of the biggest challenges to actually scaling AI is the impacts on culture. So I want to come back to you on that, okay? Brian, can you tell me from your perspective, what are some of the challenges you see in actually operationalize AI at scale?
No, I think, and this gets back to Yemi's point of moving things from a silo, making sure that you have the right subject matter expertise as far as what you think the field resources would be, and providing a feedback loop on that data. So these data, the models aren't trained in a vacuum, right? And to his point, there are additional model solutions that you can certainly have as a service. But part of that, again, gets back to the dynamic and scalable nature of how those things are going to operate in the field, right? So, certainly there was a lot of investment now for edge and advanced computing that gets those solutions closer. Dan mentioned, advancements in IoT and other edge capable devices that, provide a little bit more dynamic nature when it comes to small computing behavior. But a lot of this is, again, pushing data and trainable data out to field and for edge to take advantage of, so you can start doing more dynamic and scalable things. I think we're at the infancy of that. A lot of it is more federated in data center operations, right? With very specialized models, usually fueled by an innovation project that are focusing on a specific area. But I think as things start to advance, and now that we have these more edge capable devices, I think a lot of the ethics issues that we're talking about when it comes to policy of when and when not to use this, when and when not are we detecting an object or a biometric challenge that doesn't involve a person, which may be a little bit less complex and a little bit more straightforward. We need to really strongly concentrate on what are some of the ethical concerns that everyone's highlighting as you start to detect, should this person be here? What is their intent? And what are additional challenge restrictions we want to have around that to be more effective? And so effectively kind of looking at the mission outcome of what we're trying to do and kind of going back from that is certainly where I think we're starting to see a lot of ask from industry, and we're trying to support it with the products and investments to make sure that you have that life cycle of training and having a feedback loop for production, that you'll have a capable model that you can start to bridge that gap back to what was considered to be siloed activities to start with, if that makes sense.
It does. And Brian, I think Dan had mentioned, Dan had mentioned earlier about adversarial concerns about AI, right? How it can be used against you. Can you talk to that as you think forward, the way smart cities are being envisioned, the proliferation of IoT, as Dan mentioned from the statistics? What are some of your concerns going forward with some of the more nefarious uses of AI?
No, absolutely. I think part of it, like any solution where you're trying to make things more effective and you're making them more distributed, obviously you create more opportunities for folks to take advantage of those, right, from the distributed nature. And so, and I think as part of Homeland's mission when it comes to public safety and obviously the integrity of the systems we're talking about for the US, those become entry points for other non-state actors and other folks to be able to take advantage of those. So what we're seeing is certainly additional security constraints, additional standard processes, whether it's DevSecOps pipelines for developing applications and data, and really pushing that forward so things are not as exploitable. And as you start to develop those solutions and the associated data, that you have those effective gateways in place in order to make sure that folks will not take advantage of. And as part of it, the recent investments in cyber that is coming down from presidential executive orders, I think those are making those things more apparent that we need to focus on them, as well as additional policy constraints and getting the right people to focus on those areas. Because again, it's not just a technology problem, it's how you staff, how you set those solutions up. Elements of zero trust and authentication become part of that, that ecosystem to protect that data and the associated models.
Appreciate that, Brian. Yeah, I mentioned earlier research directions, right? So you're the central research organization for DHS, and I realize you're waiting for requirements and components, but where do you see, in the context of smart cities, I know it's the passion of yours, where do you see some of the fundamental research topics going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Reggie. And I would like just to echo one thing Brian said, this whole issue about the quality of the AI, the test beds. If we're going to really move into AI, not just the workforce, but the public we're supporting has to have high confidence, that the decisions being made, the autonomy, that's perhaps granted to devices at the edge for decision making. We need to make sure that the public has very, very high confidence that these things are operating correctly. And the core data sets Yemi also talked to do the testing on is critical to that. We also have to have ways to surveil for bias and drift in these data sets over time. And getting back to your concern about threat vectors, certainly if we empower and create a lot of autonomy out there on devices and somebody's able to get in there, that'll be just perhaps devastating to us. So one of the areas that I think is really interesting to think about is incident management, incident dispatch. So what if through AI, we're able to dispatch first responders just a few minutes sooner, reduce an average dispatch times for the nation, by 2 or 3 minutes, because through AI, when a call is coming into the dispatch center, the information is more automatically collected. The dispatch request is going out to whoever the responding service faster, and perhaps using AI, perhaps using drones, other types of surveillance capabilities. By the time the first responders are on scene, the AI capable device have already compiled a whole bunch of information for them. What are there people in the building that need to be saved? And the building's providing information to the firefighters as they show up. If we've got an active shooter environment, can we provide additional information both to keep people safe and support the first responders coming in? I mean, you can imagine when you think forward about the 500 billion interconnected devices that are going to be out there, with some autonomy and intelligence at the edge, with availability to connect through public safety. What can that do? How do we get the right information to the right person at the right time who's authorized to have it. And authorization is always a big deal in these settings, and creating autonomous policy-driven decision-making. Who can get what information? One's an absolutely critical part of this. But how many lives could we save? How much could we reduce the impact of an incident, whether it's a natural disaster or some type of man-made event? I think that's really great to think about. Just with conventional product technologies, we've made a lot of progress. With AI in there, with this software, the data sets driving it, I think there's phenomenal opportunities, particularly in city urban areas. If you think forward, where 6G becomes practical and reliable, the volume of information we'll be able to move in real time, just is going to be amazing.
Appreciate that. Yemi, so listening to some of this, you mentioned test beds, Dan's talking about kind of going, future application of this. One of my concerns, and I want to ask you about, what about the adoption of this? So, you can do these things at pilot level, but what are the challenges to actually adopting these kind of practices and the workflows that you mentioned for the larger enterprise? And is culture part of that? But like I said, either way, what do you see as some of the major problems in adoption at enterprise scale?
I think Dan hit on one. Is it's really confidence in what ML will do for you, what AI will do for you. As you allow things to happen in an automated fashion, where a person isn't managing it anymore, there's just that trust factor. So there has to be ways of showing trust to the current operator that, yeah, you can do other things and allow this to do this in an automated fashion. Also, just having some ways to QA. Because again, as ML grows and it learns, it's actually learning on its own, taking data input. And then one of the big things is making sure there's data. So folks have to be comfortable with the data going in to know that the responses and actions mean a ton. We're talking about smart cities. Real simple, probably a silly example is if in one state, a lot means a parking lot, and another state, a lot is a parcel of land, like real estate or a house or something. If you call emergency, response and they're going to a lot, which lot are you going to? And that may seem like a very simplistic scenario, but what happens if you build and grow on that and you're going towards a lot and you get to the wrong place? Those 2 minutes you tried to save could be an extra 30 minutes in confusion. Same thing in an instance of immigration. There are names that are 5 names long. There are 5 actual words for your name, and sometimes that's all your first name, and there is no surname. So how do we continue to learn and know that this culture that is really 10 miles from another culture is different, and how do we continuously grow? And what happens if something changes? Countries aren't always the same. Countries evolve. So being able to adjust and pivot with things that change, and have folks be confident in the fact that ML will adjust with it. Because if there isn't confidence, or quite frankly, if the confidence is low, appropriately, then we have challenges in what we're executing. And have challenges in really executing the mission properly. So just unpacking it there is really about confidence, and really about making sure that ML does the right thing for us.
How do you think industry can support you, Yemi, in terms of getting that kind of confidence, or can it? What do you think the next steps are?
I will say, challenge to the industry for me are a couple things. Brian, you talked about, making sure we're testing so that things aren't siloed. I would throw something out to industry. I think there should be a way for organizations that are different to interact. I know that's, maybe it's slightly pushing against laissez-faire here, but I think that it should be appropriate for different types of technology in different companies for you to do some kind of litmus test. Because when you come to me and you say, I have auto ML in my platform and someone else has auto ML on their platform, or maybe I'm not using auto ML, it'd be great for the user or the customer to know what are those differences and how can I engage you? Keep it on a fair playing field, but a better understanding of how I approach certain technologies that may be slightly different and how I apply it. Also, really having the industry understand different use cases and data. All data isn't the same. All immigration missions aren't the same. All DHS missions aren't the same. So having it more honed in, because this is an evolving, complex technology. It'd be great if the mission side of it was well understood, so that we can get through the maneuvers and the variations of how we use the technology. So I think if all that's done up front, it gives us a large platform to collaborate on, and then we'll get the best use out of that. So I think there's just so much more that we can do up front from an industry perspective before we engage. Because once we're engaging, we're asking really poignant questions. We're trying to get some answers, and we're trying to move pretty quick. It'd be good if we had a lot more prep before we engage.
So Brian, how do you respond to that?
No, I think Yemi highlights something that we certainly think as industry is important, is having flexibility and openness and understanding and verifiability when it comes to model development, right? As you go to train the solutions, and we talked a little bit about some of the ethics concerns and understanding of how those models are built, the more proprietary, the more closed loop, the less open solutions that have the ability to kind of adapt, because certainly some of the biometric challenges we talked about, some of the other fleet management and logistics may be different across different agencies in DHS, but there has to be a sharing of that data and streaming of that information and making sure that it's viable across those different elements. So we certainly support that. It's part of our platform play, and we're encouraging other industry partners to make sure that they can be part of the community of developing proper models and then being able to scale those things out and make them more dynamic as part of that overall ecosystem. So we absolutely agree, and Red Hat and other industry partners are investing that to make sure that we can guarantee that those mission outcomes.
Yeah, I'm going to keep on this for a bit. Yemi, you mentioned that it's important for industry to understand the use cases, right? How would they find that out? How do you work with industry to help them understand what these use cases are and what the nuances of them are as well?
There's a couple ways, and there's scenarios out in the news. Obviously, that's a simple part, but forums like this, I think these are great because we're having kind of formal conversation now, but afterwards, a lot of times we'll exchange information, and then we actually have some kind of one-on-one sessions or group sessions where we really get to talk, and we really get to talk about brass tacks. So I think there are different ways to engage. One is the more formal, because then we get into hundreds and thousands of folks to see us talk, and they're saying, well, okay, so here are the things we can do, and I guess Red Hat does want to support other companies doing collaboration. And so now you've made that statement. Now we can start to find other forms that have a more focused conversation about that. The other thing is just knock on our door. I'm always open to talking to folks. So a lot of folks kind of ping me on LinkedIn, and I'll respond there. I'll get emails. I think it's important for the federal community to be able to be open and talk about what we do, so that those things that maybe we don't publish in the paper. Because we're talking about mission and operations, but there's a whole nother facet to this that I think you hinted on a little bit, Brian. Our technical environments. I would love for ML to be all over the place, so I never have anything break down, and I have more than 5 nines uptime because I have self-healing. Well, how do we do that? And it sounds really easy, but we have very complex environments with multiple pieces of technology that sometimes just don't play together anyway. So to be able to explain that, why we're doing something, the intent, because a lot of things are intent. If I tell you my intent, you'll say, well, why don't you try this? Because I know why you did that, but because of what I understand you're trying to do, here's how I get you there. So, those conversations happen at different levels.
So Dan, from your perspective, I mean, how do you see ML propagating across the department? And what are some of the challenges from headquarters perspective do you see from propagating, whether it's the data or the models or the testing?
Lots a lot, Reggie. Thank you.
Anytime I can help.
So, yeah. So it's really interesting to listen to this conversation. I think back to when I joined the department in 2005, and you think about why DHS was stood up. In many aspects, it was stood up into some of the findings after 9/11 on our inability to share, particularly in the within the law enforcement, community, among federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, all the players share appropriately. All the information was out there and aggregated. So we've made a lot of progress in that space, but data sharing, data interoperability remains an enormous problem. So that's a problem that's kind of independent of AI. It's a problem that we put a lot of effort into the last few years, or last decade or more, we've gotten a lot better at. But there's a whole lot of different classifications of data. This whole issue of how do you automate digital trust is remains something that we really need to tackle. But we're really going to unleash the ability for AI tools, to get at these enormous data sets that are held not just by DHS, by others. And as you do that, part of it is how do you do the the digital trust, between systems, between machines, between the people who are going to be accessing them, so that they're authorized and you can be secure, and you stay within law, civil rights, civil liberties, privacy. That remains a huge issue. I actually think AI may be part of the solution to that. There's an incredible number of permutations that come out there when you start trying to combine the types of classification, even if it's for official use only or law enforcement sensitive type classifications, all the derivatives of that. Try to combine that with an end user who is a specific classification or user access rights that's assigned to them, along with the device that they're on, and maybe the network they're on. Huge numbers of permutations and computations that need to happen to determine whether or not I can have access to a particular piece of data at some endpoint I'm on. Thinking about AI, ML helping drive, enabling that type of data sharing, I think is something else that's very exciting, in addition to enabling the mission. Across the department has a strategy. I mean, it starts with, as you're talking to Yemi about, what are requirements and use cases? To some degree, everything the department does is a potential application for AI in the future. We have long-range BAA, broad agency announcement out there right now from S&T's website. If you have ideas, that AI might apply to one of those problems, I encourage you to submit something. We're very open to looking at how we can apply novel solutions to these things. In addition to the requirements and use cases, an AI-trained workforce is something that we also need to start building. You really have to have staff that understands AI. Maybe don't have to be able to code it. They got to understand what it does. And if we're going to have a workforce, that is working with AI, that's some part of autonomy. The machines are making some decisions, presenting recommendations. What's the human role? What's the human factor? What are the decisions and rights that we're going to hold to the human only? And that's a huge part of, I think, the advantage perhaps AI have to the department to reduce that decision paralysis. Get people reacting to the information that humans react to the best, and get out of all this rote analysis that we do to provide decision makers with ideas. How much can we do that faster and better using AI? So I think training the workforce is going to be a huge factor as well, Reggie.
Thanks. You brought up a bunch of things there. Two I'd like to pull out on. One is where you ended workforce development, but the other is also this whole area of human machine teaming, right? Because there's been a lot of research showing that the best way to use AI is actually human machine teaming, not necessarily having something run autonomously. So going back to you, Yemi, I mean, have you guys thought about that, right? I mean, what is the optimal use of humans and machines in different workflows? Do you figure that out, or is it just kind of just ad hoc?
Yeah, I won't say we figured it out and have the master plan, but I can tell you, our posture right now is, as we're using ML in certain area, it's the human as the quality assurance as we're in our journey. So you'll have things that were normally done by a human that is now done by machine learning. So we try to find areas, pivotal areas in that decision-making process where the human now can check to make sure, is this what I expect? Should this be different? And the more we do that and the more confidence you build in, the less you'll have the human do it, and move on to the other areas. So maybe it's something as simple as identifying a document. And if that works out really well, then now the human doesn't necessarily have to identify the document, but maybe check to make sure the data that has been abstracted from the document is consistent each and every time. There are no anomalies. So as you do that, you become more comfortable. I think where we can grow to is, like you said, how does the human and the machine work in tandem? And those are the jobs moving forward. So I can tell you, we haven't fully gotten there yet, but that's part of our journey. I do want to touch on something that Dan said, that if I can highlight on a banner and wave across the country, I would do. It's really data sharing. So in addition to what we're doing with ML, it's as we have these data repositories, one, the ability to share seamlessly, but two, understanding the paradigm in which we share. That old school data sharing trend where we use NEAM to make sure we're using the right canonical model and make sure all the information passes forth. It's helpful, but in our instance, an applicant and a suspect can be the same person, but you're approaching and dealing with them in a different paradigm. So that data is really important, that it's right and it's well understood. So as it goes through its life cycle, as it changes, the model changes with it, so you know how to approach it, because that causes a lot of challenges when that data comes back and forth and presents itself. So I think, that's where humans can come in the loop a little more, is to help the machine understand the permutations of the same person with kind of data at different purpose.
So I want to pull on that some more, Yemi, the data sharing piece of this, because I know when I was at DHS, there was a lot of push on sharing of data for cyber incidents, right? And a lot of push on that. In fact, I think that the moderator last panel, Dr. Schneck, put a lot of time into that when she was in the department. What are some of the challenges to data sharing that you see right now that are preventing us from actually sharing the data?
One of the big ones is in terms of data stewardship. Sometimes you feel the data that you have is yours and that you cannot share it. And what are the pieces of data to share? And then when you do share, how does that data fit together to make the big picture? Threat vectors are sometimes different. Our threat vector is not the same as a CBP or an ICE. So being able to overlay the data to have a protection scheme for DHS, isn't it easy coming from our silos at point. And that's kind of where we lean on DHS, S&T to say, here's what that looks like for everyone. Here's where the overlays are. Here's how you have to approach sharing that data. Something as simple as, you have a landscape of folks that, may need protection and they're coming in on an airport. Well, we know CBP covers the ports and CIS covers the folks. We just need to make sure that data overlays so that it gives you one picture and that you'll know how to protect those folks. And it sounds easy, but it's not always as easy, because it's not like the data is all in one place. It comes from such different systems, which has data in different parts of the journey. So we have to take the data out and put it in a place, whether it's virtual, whether it be a repository, to be able to overlay that so it makes one picture. It's really about the pictures that we get, so we know how to use the data. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, outside of saying I can't send you that data because you may not have the authority to use that data in a certain way. And I think we can work through that a lot easier than having the right paradigms.
Got it. Dan, could you chime in on that? What do you see from your position in terms of challenges with data sharing? You've seen this for years, right, at DHS?
Yeah, and it runs from the highly technical. Is your data in a standard? Is it in any standard? That I can understand, that you can export to me, that I can break down to some of the issues that Yemi spoke to. It's just a core piece, regardless of AI ML, right? It's a core piece of enabling us to do the mission. So understanding, what data is available, how to standardize it and exchange it. And we have to make sure we're doing that in alignment with all, privacy, civil rights, civil liberties, legal framework, policy framework. And a lot it's very difficult. A lot of these are legacy databases, going back, decades and decades and decades, where, people even already start thinking about, nimble, relational or more advanced database structures. So it can be very difficult to understand what's in those data. Can I have a whole record? Can I just have a subset of the record? Are there different classifications within that record? So the combinations and permutations, get really fast. The degree to which AI can help us, drive those roles and those understandings, so we can do that with confidence, with authority, but with autonomy, much faster, is going to be something we really need. And in the context we've been talking about a lot, we've been talking about database that by and large may be a bit static. They're getting updated, maybe someone's entered a new form in the system. But then you translate the issue to, we talked about smart cities, resilient cities, an incident happening in real time in the field, where maybe you have multiple law enforcement, emergency response units, local level, mutual aid coming in from multiple jurisdictions, the types of it, you got video, you got text, you got language, data, maybe you need to unlock parcel data, infrastructure data, who owns that data, how do I get it? Really complex problems when you start extending it to incident management at the local level, whether it's for law enforcement or hazard response. Just understanding if the data is available and how can I get it, who do I reach out to, is another problem that we really haven't solved. So I might be better at seeing problems and solutions, but I think AI is going to help us with it all. But it just remains one of the big issues. We've gotten a lot better, the last 20 years or so, but there's just so much more to do with the data and information sharing space.
Thanks, Dan. Brian, can you chime in here, right? I mean, from the industry perspective, you see at Red Hat, you see a lot of different parts, right? What are your thoughts on this data sharing issue?
No, I think both Dan and Yemi highlight the fact that you can't have one database to rule them all, right? You need to have, federation. You need to have, and to the point on actionable information, some of it may go away, so you only have it for a certain time period to be able to action on, right? And so I think machine learning as anomaly detection, as the ability to kind of scale out and do some form of discernment operational and information, I think is kind of the low hanging fruit from machine learning. As you start to get into more cognitive discernment and more proactive remediation, right? I think we're at our infancy and there's opportunities as we described in different use cases. Certainly data becomes more important once you start doing cognitive discernment in real time, right? To have that information available as well as whatever the security threats would be along with that. But there are additional opportunities when it comes to streaming of resources, other types of edge architectures that allow you to kind of federate data so you don't have the traditional dependencies of database technology, right? As you start to scale this information out, but really getting that information where a model can activate on it becomes, the data engineering piece of this that makes all the rest of it work, right? And so, these are all areas that we as Red Hat and other industry partners are trying to expand the ecosystem, because a single partner will not solve what we're describing here, right? It's an ecosystem of folks working together. And we certainly want to be a valid participant in that to help DHS moving forward.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you is the tech is there, right, to do this, but partnerships are important. So let's talk about those partnerships, right? So how do you, because when I think about an ecosystem, these kind of innovation ecosystems, it's academia, it's industry, it's government, right? And how do you think about it? I mean, what kind of partners does your organization have? And are there things you think that that industry, academia should know in ways that could foster better partnering?
Yeah, so we have great partners in DHS S&T. We use quite a bit. We have great industry partners. I would say we pull in academia in scenarios. I mean, I think that could beef up a little bit because, and again, it's that breeding ground and testing ground. Academia has really a lean forward ability to do a lot of things that we wouldn't want to do as operators. So I think we can lean on that a little bit, especially for scenarios. I think where we can lean a little more is also productizing. Brian started to talk about something that piqued my interest. We haven't talked a lot about the tooling. So you were, Brian, just describing kind of like a federated environment, lake house, ponds, or to some nature across different organizations that you can use AI/ML to activate. And so a lot of things highlighted. You talked about data engineering. There's really a resource sharing aspect to that. And then there's a standardization aspect to that. Not that you're using the same tooling, but we need to understand that as organizations, we have to find that lingua franca, right? Not just for AI/ML and data, but for being able to connect to each other. Because now you start to highlight other things. And if academia and research can get there before we do, it makes it easier for us to pick up and run with that. Because the life cycle of industry is a lot of things become productized, and before we know it, it's going to be it's going to be easier for one of my kids to do ML on their phone as it is for a government agency to build it in an enterprise. And that's good, but that's also not so good because if we move too quick, then we'll start to introduce some of those things that we don't want to introduce. So how do we balance that out by doing collaborations with academia, industry, as well as making sure that we understand those standards? I think it's just increased collaboration. I think we got to do a better job of pulling folks together.
Also, do you think you get an opportunity to reach out enough to the smaller companies, right? The venture-backed companies, the PE-backed companies. Do you think you get an opportunity to do that?
I think at our organization we
Yeah.
do, because we've made it a point to do that in the past couple of years. We've seen how smaller companies are actually very, very, very nimble. So especially in niche areas. So you'll have a small company that's all they do, and so that makes us smarter too. I would say government writ large may not do that. So I think that's something that the government could do. We enjoy it. Every time I meet with a vendor, a different vendor, I get smarter. And so as we start to meet with vendors, what we try to do is say, hey, did you know this vendor? They do this. How about you guys come together? One of the things our CTO is really great for doing is we have these tech talks. And so we'll have one vendor come and talk and invite all the other vendors. So we have a dialogue. It's an opportunity for us to really check ourselves. Are we all doing the right thing? And do we find any anomalies or things that are misconceptions that now we can talk about? And all the vendors can go back and start to fix it.
No, very interesting. Dan, from DHS S&T's perspective, I mean, I know you have a lot of partnerships. I mean, do you think that there are other things you can be doing? I mean, first of all, maybe you can talk to some of your university partnerships and the way you're working with the venture-backed communities, but are there things that particularly in this area that you could be doing differently or better?
Sure. So we do have is pretty broad group of university partners through our consortiums. Again, if you research our website, they're there. We do reach out and support research collaboratively with the National Science Foundation. We also have a group that's dedicated to industry partnerships. And we have things like prize authorities where we put out things and we just ask for novel ideas. We have our Silicon Valley program. Again, the long range broad agency announcements are out there. It's a way for us to just put things out and say, these are the problems we're trying to solve. Sometimes you also publish more focused broad agency announcements, which may be going after a more narrow topic. One of the things we haven't talked about though, and it kind of maybe would get to some of these issues we're talking about, particularly around testing. We do a lot of operational experimentation, particularly around communications interoperability. We've had tests where, we've had hundreds of players. We bring state and local, federal users of technologies together, and then we bring in private sector solutions, demonstration of capabilities. What's really out there today. A lot of times we find that industry may have 60-70% solution, something we need. And before we want to move forward and spend R&D dollars on it, it's preferable that we understand if, do we do our tech scouting right? Does industry have this capability? And we'll often try to get, people with industry have solutions, get them some type of controlled environment, a test range, where we have, requirements that are established by the components, and run real operational experimentation against those. We've done a lot of that in the countering unmanned aerial systems space as well. And it seems like, we're probably a year or more away from doing it, but it seems like some of the issues we're talking about today, that type of operational experimentation where we're taking mission set requirements such as Yemi has in a controlled environment, working with industry to see how well their solutions meet our requirements is probably something we ought to really be thinking about for the future.
Excellent. Brian, from your perspective, are there any barriers to more effective partnerships that you think DHS should be addressing?
Well, I think part of that is, and I think we talked about some of the siloed elements and obviously things that are fit to purpose. I think the broad cross-agency scenarios that we're talking about is certainly an area that we can all take advantage of. As Red Hat kind of fostering AI and ML practices, we have blueprints that we create that are available that our own product engineering tests against our models, as well as we fostered what is called the Open Data Hub, which is basically a collection of different data resources leveraging open source data tooling that most data scientists want to use as part of those practices. And I'm starting to actually have managed solutions that folks can take advantage of across different cloud environments, including high performance solutions that may be more closer to edge. So folks can start doing this type of experimentation, right? And getting back to Dan's comment around being able to test these things in an innovative lab and use it, the more that we can foster community about reference blueprinted data solutions, the ability to make computing not the barrier, but the advantage of having those solutions be translatable from cloud down to ground so folks can operational on. We're trying to reduce the barriers as it relates to data use and how solutions are fostered from a platform perspective, thereby being able to enable the rest of what we're describing. But certainly we have other industry partners and other SIs that are embedding these type of solutions into as well. And we're always looking for great suggestions, as well as some of the other academic investments that are being done, being able to foster that along with other industry partners. So we're certainly committed to making sure that DHS becomes more effective from a data strategy, but then also leveraging that as part of the NMO models moving forward.
Excellent. So I'd like to end with the last question, all of you guys, starting, I guess, with you, Yemi. This is workforce. So Dan brought up workforce earlier. right, the importance of workforce development. What are you doing with respect to workforce development? And are there things you would like people to know about how to get involved in these kind of areas?
Yeah, we're fortunate that we have a very, very capable workforce. I like to say that, outside of even the IT organization, we have some of the most savvy operators that know IT. So what we try to do is we have forums where we can, informally discuss. So from our IT colleagues to our non-IT colleagues, we're always discussing things, especially AIML. And in those groups where they have requirements, we don't just talk requirements, we really talk about the entire technology so that they're aware of it. So I think that's where it starts when the business teams come over and say, I need to move faster, I need this technology. We describe it, we explain it, and we educate so that when they go back to that workforce, it isn't kind of like a cloak of secrecy that ML is going to come in your computer and it's going to just start controlling things. That's where we get folks scared. But really understand these are models. These are models that your influence helps to train. And as we go back and train it, it's trained the way you want to see the outcome. And so that folks aren't afraid of it. They're actually excited about it because, to be quite honest with you, what we haven't really talked about is the demand. Hiring is absolutely crazy right now. We have more jobs than we have people for them, and even if we had enough people for the jobs, there's more work than the people that we have. So these are absolutely good tools that help us be more efficient and to kind of catch up to where we need to be. So as we explain those things, I think people become quite comfortable and frankly excited about what they need to do to get AI and ML in the workplace.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah.
It's a really, really interesting question. Agreeing with Yemi said, it's kind of a research organization, maybe thinking a little more foundationally. As I listen to the conversation here, it really strikes me what we're talking about is intelligence in the workspace being shared between a machine and a human. What does that really, really mean? How much decision authority autonomy should humans let machines have? How do we figure that out? Particularly when you start thinking about the interconnected world, the amount of data, the ubiquitousness of sensors, what's going to be the ability of machine intelligence, to influence our lives, and if we grant them autonomy, make fundamental decisions. How much do we want the human in the loop? What does it look like? This is coming at us. It's distributed. It's just decentralized. I think it's going to be highly disruptive. You can just foresee there's going to be exponential growth of AI applications. And to me, from a worker perspective, myself, that tells me I'm probably going to lose a lot of control. There's going to be a lot out there. There's going to be a lot happening with data sets that's moving very, very fast. And I think it's going to be one of the things that we struggle with as a workforce in government to keep up with it, understand our role, and stay ahead of it.
Thanks. Brian, you get the last word.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, I think kind of drawing on what Dan and Yemi is talking about is as far as staffing out an effective workforce that understands how to create ethically based, open, transparent models to solve mission challenges. We really want to create a community around a platform and common tooling so they understand the language of that enablement. Understand that it is exciting in the sense that you are augmenting maybe some of the rudimentary tasks that would not necessarily be the best for mission outcome in order to make field folks as well as other folks more effective when it comes to the usage of these technologies. And then the more that you're using standard kind of open tooling to make that happen, it becomes less a proprietary strategy around traditional resources, but more a loose organization or community around solving these things collectively. And I think we certainly embrace that and want to be able to foster that as part of Red Hat's approach. Lastly, we have innovation labs as well as other industry partners that certainly can help scale some of these other areas out as folks start to understand more what they're trying to do. And certainly we would love to partner further with Homeland to understand better about how we can be more effective, not only as Red Hat, but the rest of the industry partners that we work with.
Right. Listen, gentlemen, great conversation. Thank you so much.